I was wiping down table 14 when the crystal chandelier exploded above Dante Ravenna's head, and 7 men in tactical gear stormed through Luciano's back entrance with enough firepower to level a city block, turning what had been an ordinary Tuesday evening shift into the kind of nightmare I thought I'd left behind 3 years ago when I faked my own death and disappeared into the comfortable obscurity of minimum wage and polyester uniforms. The sound was what hit me first. Not the visual chaos that would follow, but the distinctive crack of high-velocity rounds punching through Murano glass and antique fixtures. A sound I'd heard in a dozen different countries under a dozen different names, and my body responded before my mind could catch up. Muscle memory overriding 3 years of carefully constructed normalcy as I dropped the wine-stained cloth and assessed the tactical situation with the cold precision of a woman who used to kill people for a living. Dante Ravenna sat at his usual corner table, the one with the perfect vantage point of both entrances and the kitchen, surrounded by his personal guard of 4 men who were already moving to shield him even as the first bullets tore through Pietro's chest and sent him crashing backward into the wine display that shattered in a cascade of burgundy and broken glass that looked too much like the crime scenes I used to create. The Mafia boss himself remained eerily calm, his obsidian eyes scanning the restaurant with the practiced assessment of a predator who'd survived countless assassination attempts. And even from across the dining room, I could see the moment his gaze landed on me and registered something that made his expression shift from calculated survival to sharp, dangerous curiosity. I'd been serving him overpriced pasta and carefully watered-down wine for 6 months now, playing the role of Alessia Corvino, the struggling waitress, so thoroughly that I'd almost forgotten the weight of a weapon in my hands or the particular satisfaction of a clean kill. But watching those tactical teams flood through the entrance with their military-grade hardware and coordinated movements, I felt the phantom stirring beneath my skin like a second heartbeat that had never really stopped, just learned to beat more quietly. The civilians were screaming now, Chicago's elite abandoning their truffle risotto and aged scotch to dive beneath tables and scramble toward exits that the attackers had already blocked with 2 men each. Professional soldiers who moved with the kind of precision that told me this wasn't some amateur hit, but a carefully orchestrated execution planned by someone with serious resources and absolutely no concern for collateral damage. Table 7's anniversary couple huddled behind an overturned chair, while their waiter, Marcus, bled out from a gut shot that would take him 20 agonizing minutes to die from. And something in me that should have stayed buried cracked wide open as I watched a perfectly innocent kid who'd shared his tips with me just last week, gasping for air through punctured lungs. Dante's remaining guards were returning fire now, the confined space of Luciano's turning into a deafening echo chamber of gunshots and shattered porcelain, and I found myself moving through the chaos with the fluid grace of my former life. No longer Alessia the waitress, but something far more dangerous as I grabbed the nearest wine bottle, a 1982 Chateau Margaux that some hedge fund manager had been showing off just minutes ago, and brought it down across the skull of the tactical soldier who'd made the mistake of turning his back to the service station where I'd been standing. He went down hard, his helmet absorbing some of the impact, but not enough to prevent the concussion that left him sprawling across the marble floor. And I was already moving, already adapting, already slipping back into the lethal rhythm of violence that I'd spent 3 years trying to forget, snatching his sidearm from its holster before he could recover, and putting 2 rounds through the faceplate of his partner, who'd started to turn toward the unexpected threat I represented. The weight of the gun in my hand felt like coming home and losing myself simultaneously, a terrible comfort that reminded me exactly why I'd walked away from this life. But there wasn't time for existential crisis when 7 heavily armed men were systematically executing everyone in the restaurant. When Dante Ravenna's blood was already staining his expensive Italian suit from the shoulder wound he'd taken in the initial assault. When innocent people who'd come here for nothing more sinister than overpriced carbonara were dying because they'd had the misfortune of choosing the wrong restaurant on the wrong night. I moved through the chaos like a ghost made flesh, using the overturned tables for cover as I put down another attacker with a shot that took him through the exposed gap between his vest and helmet. the kind of precision kill that required intimate knowledge of tactical gear vulnerabilities and years of training that no struggling waitress should possess. Dante was watching me now, really watching me, his 3 remaining guards forming a protective barrier around him, even as they registered the impossible sight of their regular waitress fighting with the practiced efficiency of a special forces operator. And I could see the exact moment recognition flickered across his face. Could see him putting together pieces of a puzzle that would get me killed if I let him survive long enough to complete it. But there were still 4 attackers standing, and the hostages cowering beneath tables needed someone to create an exit strategy that didn't end with all of them catching stray bullets. So I made a decision that would change everything, grabbing a serving tray from the abandoned station and using it to deflect the burst of automatic fire that one of the tactical soldiers sent my direction before I closed the distance between us, with movements too fast for his gear-heavy response time to match. The tray's edge caught him across the throat in exactly the right spot to collapse his trachea. Years of anatomical knowledge translating into lethal application, and I was already spinning away from his falling body to engage the next threat. A larger man, who'd started toward Dante's position with the kind of focused determination that marked him as the team leader, the one who wouldn't stop until his primary target was confirmed dead. I intercepted him 3 feet from Dante's table, my borrowed handgun empty now, but my hands very much not, and we went down in a tangle of limbs and tactical gear that would have been comical if it wasn't so desperately lethal, grappling across blood-slicked marble while his team tried to get a clear shot that wouldn't risk hitting their commander. He outweighed me by at least 80 pounds, and had military training that showed in every counter-move he attempted. But I'd been trained by people who made military special forces look like enthusiastic amateurs, trained in the kind of close-quarters combat that left no room for mercy or hesitation. And when my fingers found the pressure point beneath his jaw that would render him unconscious for the next 6 hours, I felt the familiar cold satisfaction of a technique executed perfectly. The 3 remaining attackers were regrouping now, reassessing their tactical situation in light of this unexpected variable I represented, and I used their momentary hesitation to grab the team leader's combat knife from his belt and send it spinning across the dining room with the kind of throw that required calculating trajectory, rotation, and target movement simultaneously, the blade burying itself in the eye socket of the soldier who'd been moving to flank Dante's position from the kitchen entrance. Dante's guards used my distraction to take down another attacker, their combined fire overwhelming his body armor in the kind of brutal efficiency that reminded me these weren't just businessmen's muscle but serious operators in their own right. And suddenly the odds had shifted from impossible to merely catastrophic. 2 attackers remaining against myself, and 3 trained guards, protecting a wounded crime lord in a restaurant full of traumatized civilians who would absolutely tell the police everything they'd witnessed here tonight. I found myself standing back to back with one of Dante's men, a scarred beast named Luca, who I'd served espresso to every Tuesday for half a year. Both of us covering different angles while the remaining tactical soldiers tried to find an approach that wouldn't get them killed. And in that moment of synchronized violence, I felt something I'd been running from for 3 years, the terrible rightness of being exactly what I was trained to be, the perfect fit of purpose and ability that made all the blood and horror feel almost holy. The final 2 attackers must have reached the same conclusion I had about how badly their operation had deteriorated, because they started their retreat with the disciplined coordination of professionals who knew when to cut their losses, laying down suppressing fire as they backed toward the service entrance they'd breached through. And I had maybe 3 seconds to decide whether to let them go or pursue them into what was certainly a prepared extraction route, with backup waiting. But Dante was bleeding heavily now, his face going pale in the way that suggested serious blood loss, and someone needed to get him medical attention before Chicago lost one of its most powerful crime lords to something as mundane as hypovolemic shock. So I made another choice that would complicate my carefully constructed new life, moving to his side as his guards maintained cover fire against the retreating attackers. His blood was soaking through the expensive fabric of his suit, hot and slick against my hands as I pressed my waitress apron against the wound with pressure that would hurt like hell, but might keep him conscious long enough to get to safety. And up close I could see the exact moment his pain-hazed eyes focused on my face with recognition that went deeper than 6 months of Tuesday evening wine service. Recognition that reached back years to a different name and a very different kind of interaction. "We need to move," I told him, my voice steady despite the adrenaline crash I could feel building in my system, despite the fact that I'd just revealed capabilities that would make me a target for every intelligence agency and criminal organization that thought the Phantom was safely dead and buried. "Your shoulder's torn up, but you'll live if we get you somewhere secure in the next 20 minutes. And staying here means explaining to Chicago PD why their favorite restaurant looks like a war zone, and why you just happened to be here when it happened." Luca and the other surviving guards, Marco and a kid whose name I'd never learned, were already moving to secure an exit route through the kitchen, their training evident in how efficiently they cleared the path while maintaining defensive positions. And I found myself half carrying a man who probably weighed twice what I did, his expensive cologne mixing with the copper tang of blood as we navigated through the chaos toward the relative safety of the alley behind Luciano's. The kitchen was a disaster of overturned equipment and scattered ingredients. Chef Antonio hiding in the walk-in freezer with his sous chef, both of them wide-eyed with terror that would absolutely translate into detailed police statements unless someone convinced them that staying silent was in their best health interests. But that was a problem for later. For after I'd dealt with the more immediate issue of keeping Dante Ravenna alive long enough to answer the questions burning through my mind about how this attack had happened, and who had orchestrated it with such precise intelligence about his schedule and security protocols. His black SUV was waiting in the alley, armor-plated and probably equipped with enough defensive systems to survive a rocket attack, and I helped load him into the back seat while his guards took defensive positions around the vehicle, scanning for secondary threats with the paranoid efficiency of men who'd survived in one of America's most dangerous professions through excessive caution and overwhelming firepower. "The penthouse," Dante managed through gritted teeth, his hand clamping down on my wrist with surprising strength, for someone who'd lost as much blood as the spreading stain across his torso suggested. "You're coming with us, Tesoro, because we're going to have a very interesting conversation about how a waitress fights like a fucking assassin, and why your combat style matches someone I thought died 3 years ago in a warehouse fire in Prague." His obsidian eyes locked onto mine, with an intensity that suggested he already knew exactly who I was, already recognized the specific techniques and movements that had been my signature when I operated under a different name in a different life. And as the SUV pulled away from Luciano's, with sirens already screaming their approach in the distance, I realized that saving Dante Ravenna's life might have been the biggest mistake I'd made since faking my own death and trying to disappear into normalcy. Because the way he was looking at me now, with that mixture of pain and recognition and something darker that made my pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with the adrenaline still flooding my system, suggested that he wasn't just remembering the Phantom's reputation, but something far more specific and far more personal. And his next words confirmed every terrible suspicion crystallizing in my mind as his blood continued to soak through my white blouse. "You fight like a ghost I used to know," he whispered, his grip on my wrist tightening until I could feel my pulse hammering against his fingers. "Like the woman who put a bullet in my brother's skull 5 years ago and disappeared before I could return the favor." His penthouse smelled like expensive leather and dangerous secrets, exactly how I remembered it from another lifetime when I'd studied his floor plans and security protocols for 3 weeks, before deciding that killing Dante Ravenna would create more problems than it solved. Though apparently fate had other ideas about whether our paths should cross in violently intimate ways. The elevator ride to the 47th floor was suffocating in its silence. Dante's labored breathing and the subtle mechanical hum of the ascending car, the only sounds while Luca and Marco maintained their protective positions, and I pressed my ruined apron against a wound that was still bleeding more than I liked. My hands steady, despite the catastrophic implications of everything that had just unfolded in those blood-soaked minutes at Luciano's. The crime lord's eyes never left my face during that endless vertical journey, his gaze burning with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was cataloging every micro-expression and involuntary response, building a case against me with the methodical precision of a man who'd survived decades in a business where misplaced trust was invariably fatal. When the doors finally opened onto his private domain, I was struck immediately by how perfectly the space reflected the man bleeding against my shoulder. All clean lines and calculated luxury, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Chicago's glittering skyline, furniture that probably cost more than most people earned in a year, arranged with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested someone who needed control over every aspect of his environment, needed to know exactly where every piece belonged, because chaos meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death. The walls were decorated with what I recognized as genuine Renaissance paintings, the kind that should have been in museums rather than private collections. And I found myself wondering absurdly whether the Caravaggio near the entrance was the one that had disappeared from a Venetian gallery 6 years ago during a particularly audacious heist that had never been solved. "Medical supplies are in the master suite," Dante said, his voice rougher now with pain that he was clearly trying to suppress through sheer force of will, gesturing toward a hallway that led deeper into the penthouse, with hands that trembled slightly from blood loss, despite his obvious attempts at maintaining his legendary composure. "Second door on the left, everything you'll need unless the bullet hits something major, in which case you'll find my private surgeon's number programmed into the phone on the nightstand under the name Dr. Midnight, because even my medical emergencies require theatrical pseudonyms." I helped him navigate down the hallway, acutely aware of how his weight against my side felt simultaneously foreign and unsettlingly familiar, how the heat of his body through blood-soaked fabric triggered memories I'd worked very hard to bury beneath layers of manufactured normalcy and carefully constructed amnesia. His bedroom was exactly what I'd expected. Massive bed with black silk sheets that probably had a thread count higher than my current annual salary, more expensive art, a wall of windows that offered the same commanding view of the city he controlled through violence and strategic brilliance, and tucked discreetly in the corner, a fully stocked medical station that would have made most emergency rooms jealous. "You've been shot before," I observed, guiding him to sit on the edge of his obscenely luxurious bed while I moved to examine the medical supplies with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed field medicine in significantly worse conditions than this temperature-controlled sanctuary of wealth and power. "Multiple times, judging by the quality and quantity of supplies you keep on hand, which means you either have terrible luck or you've made enough enemies that assassination attempts are just part of your regular Tuesday evening plans?" He laughed at that, the sound rough and pained but genuinely amused in a way that transformed his usually cold features into something almost human, almost approachable, before the expression shuddered again behind his carefully maintained walls of calculated intimidation. "Strip me," he commanded, his obsidian eyes tracking my movements as I returned with gauze, antiseptic, surgical tools, and local anesthetic that I was reasonably certain he wouldn't want me to use, given the way he was watching me with that predatory focus that suggested he couldn't afford the vulnerability of reduced awareness. "The jacket and shirt need to come off so you can assess the damage properly, and let's dispense with any pretense of modesty given that you've apparently been studying my security protocols closely enough to navigate my penthouse elevator system without any guidance." I helped him shrug out of the ruined suit jacket, the expensive Italian wool now stiff with dried blood that had turned the charcoal fabric nearly black, and then began working on the buttons of his dress shirt with fingers that had steadied now that the immediate crisis had passed, and training had fully reasserted itself over the panic response that normal people experienced in these situations. His torso, when I finally exposed it, was a roadmap of violence survived. Old bullet scars, knife wounds that had healed into raised keloid tissue, what looked like a burn pattern across his ribs that suggested he'd been too close to an explosion at some point in his bloody career. And I found myself tracing these markers of survival with my eyes while trying not to think about how I'd contributed my own scars to various enemies over the years. The current wound was ugly but manageable, the bullet having torn through the meat of his shoulder without hitting bone or major arteries, though the damage to surrounding tissue was significant enough that he'd need proper surgical intervention if he wanted full mobility restored. "You're lucky," I told him, setting up my workspace with the methodical precision that always helped me focus during medical procedures, arranging instruments in the exact order I'd need them, because chaos bred mistakes, and mistakes bred death. "Another inch to the right, and it would have shattered your clavicle. 2 inches down, and we'd be discussing whether you wanted to die in your own bed or risk the trip to your surgeon's underground clinic. So whatever saint you've been praying to apparently decided you still have work to do before they're ready to collect your corrupted soul." I didn't bother with the local anesthetic, recognizing in the set of his jaw and the intensity of his gaze that he wanted to stay fully present for whatever conversation was about to happen, wanted the pain to keep him sharp and focused while we navigated the dangerous territory of mutual recognition and shared history that had just exploded into our previously safe dynamic of crime lord and oblivious waitress. My hands moved with practiced confidence as I cleaned the wound, debriding damaged tissue with a scalpel that I handled with the kind of familiarity that no waitress should possess. And I could feel his eyes burning into me with every precise movement, every technique that revealed exactly how much training I'd received in keeping people alive or ending them, depending on what the mission parameters required. "You want to know how I recognized you?" he said after several minutes of silence broken only by his controlled breathing and the wet sounds of my medical work, his voice steady despite what must have been considerable pain radiating from his mangled shoulder. "You want to know what gave you away after 3 years of successfully playing dead, after you managed to convince every intelligence agency and criminal organization in the Northern Hemisphere that the Phantom had finally met her end in that warehouse fire that left nothing but charred bones and dental records that somehow perfectly matched your documented profile?" I continued working, using surgical thread to close the deeper tissue damage before addressing the external wound. My hands steady even as my heart rate kicked up several notches, because this was the conversation I'd been dreading since the moment his eyes had locked onto mine across Luciano's blood-soaked dining room. "I want to know why you didn't have your guards put a bullet in my head the moment you made the connection," I countered, pulling the sutures tight with exactly the right amount of tension to promote proper healing without causing additional tissue damage. "I want to know why a man whose brother I allegedly killed is letting me anywhere near him with sharp objects and the medical knowledge to make his death look like complications from his initial injury rather than deliberate murder. Because from where I'm sitting, this seems like spectacularly poor judgment even for someone who's lost enough blood to affect their decision-making capacity." He reached up with his good arm, his fingers closing around my wrist with enough pressure to still my hands, but not enough to actually hurt. His skin fever-hot against mine in a way that suggested infection might already be setting in, despite my careful cleaning of the wound. "Because the woman who killed my brother wouldn't have saved my life tonight," he said, his obsidian eyes searching my face with an intensity that felt like being flayed open and examined at the cellular level. "Because the Phantom I studied for 3 years after Marco's death was a ghost who didn't take sides, didn't get involved in territorial disputes, didn't save civilians or protect anyone except her mission, parameters, and the woman I watched tonight fought like she gave a damn about collateral damage, like those terrified people hiding under tables actually mattered to her instead of being acceptable losses in someone else's war." I wanted to pull away from his grip, wanted to put distance between us, and the dangerous recognition flowering in his expression. But something kept me frozen there with my hands stained with his blood and my carefully constructed lies crumbling under the weight of his observation. "You don't know anything about who I was or what I cared about," I told him, resuming my suturing with movements that were perhaps more aggressive than strictly necessary, making him hiss through his teeth at the pain I was deliberately not managing as gently as I could have. "You studied a reputation, a collection of kills and disappearances that got attributed to the Phantom because I was convenient. Because blaming a ghost meant you didn't have to look too closely at who was really pulling the triggers, or why people kept dying in ways that benefited very specific power structures. He was silent while I finished the internal sutures and moved to closing the external wound. His breathing carefully controlled, in the way that suggested he was using some kind of meditation technique to manage pain without medication. And I found myself grudgingly impressed by his discipline even as I tried not to think about how vulnerable he was in this moment. How easy it would be to finish what someone else had started tonight and eliminate one of Chicago's most dangerous crime lords while he was weakened and bleeding in his own bedroom. I know that 5 years ago someone put 3 bullets in my brother Marco's head using a very specific weapon and a very specific technique, he said finally, his voice dropping to something darker and more dangerous as he watched me tape gauze over the now-closed wound with the kind of clinical efficiency that suggested I'd done this hundreds of times before. I know that the security footage from that night showed a woman with your build, your movement patterns, your very distinctive combat style, and I know that Marco died because he'd discovered something that someone wanted kept buried. Information that he'd been planning to bring to me before he met the Phantom in that parking garage and never walked out. I stepped back from him, my medical work complete but my heart hammering now because we were approaching territory that I'd spent 3 years trying to leave behind. Secrets that had cost me everything I'd loved and forced me into a death I'd had to make convincing enough that even my enemy's enemies believed I was gone. Your brother was a traitor, I said quietly, the words falling between us like grenades with pulled pins. Whatever you think you knew about Marco Ravenna, whatever loyal soldier narrative you've been telling yourself for 5 years to make sense of his death, you're wrong, and the information he died protecting wasn't meant for you but for the people who were using him to undermine everything your family had built. The silence that followed my declaration was suffocating. Dante's entire body going rigid with a tension that had nothing to do with his injury, and everything to do with the way I'd just desecrated his brother's memory. And I watched emotions war across his usually controlled features. Rage, denial, a terrible dawning recognition that suggested some part of him had always suspected the truth, but had refused to examine it too closely, because acknowledging Marco's betrayal would mean confronting how thoroughly he'd been deceived. You're lying, he said. But there was no conviction in the accusation, only a desperate kind of hope that I would confirm his denial and let him keep believing in the version of his brother that made the loss bearable. Marco was family, blood. The only person I trusted completely in a world built on betrayal and convenient alliances. And you expect me to believe that he was working against me? That everything we built together was compromised by his treachery? I moved to the bathroom to wash his blood from my hands, the hot water running red in the expensive marble sink, while I tried to organize thoughts that had been locked away behind walls of self-preservation and strategic amnesia. I expect you to believe what the evidence supports, I called back to him, watching the water run clear as I scrubbed away the physical reminder of tonight's violence even though the psychological stains would take significantly longer to fade. I expect you to consider why someone would hire the Phantom specifically to eliminate your brother. Why they would want his death to look like a professional hit rather than an internal family matter. And I expect you to wonder what information he possessed that was worth burning your entire organization's credibility to protect. When I returned to the bedroom, Dante had managed to stand despite the injury and blood loss, his bare torso displaying all those old scars in the ambient light filtering through his floor-to-ceiling windows, and he moved toward me with the predatory grace of an apex predator who'd just identified prey that had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. "Tell me everything," he demanded, backing me against the wall with his good arm braced beside my head, his face inches from mine in a proximity that was clearly meant to intimidate, but instead sent my pulse racing for entirely different reasons that I absolutely did not want to examine. "Tell me who hired you to kill Marco. Tell me what he'd discovered that made him a target. Tell me why you've been serving me wine for 6 months, when you could have finished the job and eliminated me whenever you wanted. And most importantly, tell me your real name, because I'm done calling you Alessia, when we both know that's just another convenient fiction you've wrapped yourself in." The heat of his body against mine was overwhelming, his breath harsh against my face, his eyes burning with an intensity that suggested he would extract the truth from me through whatever means necessary if I didn't cooperate voluntarily. And I found myself trapped between the wall and the most dangerous man in Chicago, with secrets that could destroy us both if they came to light. "My name," I said slowly, my hands coming up to rest against the scarred landscape of his chest, in a gesture that was half defense and half something else entirely. "Doesn't matter any more than the phantom matters, because that woman died 3 years ago, and what you're looking at now is just a ghost trying to live long enough to find the people who murdered her family and make them pay for every single life they destroyed." His expression shifted at that, recognition flickering across his features in a way that suggested he'd just connected pieces of a puzzle that went deeper than either of our individual tragedies. "The Corsetti massacre," he breathed, his good hand coming up to grip my jaw with surprising gentleness, given the violence simmering between us. 4 years ago, an entire family wiped out in their compound outside Naples, blamed on a territorial dispute that never made sense because the Corsettis weren't involved in anything that would warrant that level of response. And the only survivor was a daughter who supposedly died 6 months later in unrelated violence that was a little too convenient to be coincidental. I didn't confirm or deny, didn't trust my voice to remain steady if I spoke the names of parents and siblings who'd been slaughtered while I was on assignment halfway across the world. But something in my expression must have given me away, because his grip tightened fractionally, and I saw understanding dawn in those obsidian depths. "And you think Marco was involved?" he continued, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, almost understanding in a way that terrified me more than his anger would have. "You think my brother had something to do with your family's death? Which means when you put those bullets in his skull, it wasn't a job but personal vengeance. And the information you mentioned that he died protecting was evidence of who really ordered the hit that destroyed everything you loved." The worst part was how easily he'd assembled the truth from scattered pieces, how thoroughly he understood the mathematics of revenge, and the way grief could transform into something cold and purposeful and absolutely lethal. And I found myself nodding slowly, because there was no point in denying what he'd already deduced with the sharp intelligence that had kept him alive and in power through decades of Chicago's bloodiest power struggles. "So when those 7 men tried to kill you tonight," I said quietly, my hands still pressed against his chest, where I could feel his heart hammering beneath scarred skin and old violence, and I made the choice to intervene instead of letting them finish what I'd apparently failed to complete 5 years ago. What does that tell you about whether I actually killed your brother, or whether we've both been played by someone who wanted us hunting each other instead of looking for the real enemy?" Before he could respond, before he could process the implications of what I'd just suggested, the penthouse's security system erupted in urgent alarms, and Luca's voice crackled through the intercom with the kind of panic that suggested whatever was happening was significantly worse than tonight's restaurant massacre. "Boss, we've got a situation," his lieutenant announced, the background noise suggesting rapid movement and weapons being readied. "Someone just delivered a package to the lobby, addressed to the Phantom in care of Dante Ravenna, and the bomb squad is saying we need to evacuate immediately because whatever's inside is ticking down from 60 seconds and showing a radiation signature that suggests this isn't just conventional explosives we're dealing with." Dante's eyes locked onto mine with an expression that combined fury and grudging respect, and something darker that made my stomach clench with anticipation. "Looks like someone knows you're alive," he said softly, his thumb tracing my jawline in a gesture that felt proprietary and possessive, and absolutely inappropriate given that we were apparently about to be vaporized by nuclear-grade revenge. "And they want to make absolutely certain that this time, when the Phantom dies, she stays dead and takes me with her. He should have killed me right there. Should have let his men paint his marble floors with my blood the moment he realized I was the ghost who'd haunted his nightmares for 5 years. But instead, he offered me a deal I couldn't refuse. while we raced down 47 floors in an elevator that felt like a coffin descending into hell, both of us knowing that the package waiting in his lobby might very well be the last thing either of us ever saw if the bomb squad's assessment was even remotely accurate about the radiation signature and the devastating payload someone had wrapped in pretty paper and malicious intent. The building's evacuation was already underway when we reached the ground floor. Wealthy residents in various states of undress flooding into the street, while Chicago PD established a perimeter that looked pitifully inadequate for containing a dirty bomb in the heart of the city's most expensive real estate. And I found myself pressed against Dante's side in a way that probably looked protective to outside observers, but felt more like two predators circling each other, while a bigger threat loomed over both our heads. His hand was firm on my lower back, keeping me close despite the freshly sutured wound that had to be screaming agony with every movement. And I could feel the tension radiating through his frame as he surveyed the chaos with the calculating assessment of someone mentally cataloging every security failure that had allowed a weapon of mass destruction to be delivered to his doorstep like some kind of radioactive gift basket. "The package is addressed to both of us," I pointed out, my voice low enough that only he could hear over the surrounding pandemonium of sirens and shouted evacuation orders. "Which means whoever sent it knows I'm here with you, knows I'm alive despite 3 years of successfully convincing the world otherwise, and wants to make a very public statement about what happens to ghosts who refuse to stay buried, and crime lords who get too close to truths that powerful people want to keep hidden." He pulled me toward the armored SUV that Luca had positioned at the perimeter, his movements efficient despite the blood loss that was making his face progressively paler, and I let him maneuver me into the back seat, because curiosity about his intentions was warring with self-preservation instincts that screamed I should disappear into the Chicago night before this situation deteriorated further. "We need to talk," he said, sliding in beside me with a wince that he tried to hide behind his legendary composure, nodding to Luca to drive us somewhere that wasn't about to become ground zero for a radiological incident. "We need to discuss why someone wants us both dead badly enough to risk the kind of international attention that comes with detonating nuclear material in an American city. And we need to figure out very quickly whether we're going to keep trying to kill each other, or whether we're going to recognize that we're both being played by an enemy sophisticated enough to orchestrate your family's massacre and my brother's betrayal, without either of us connecting the dots until tonight." The SUV pulled away from the chaos as the bomb squad deployed their robotic units to examine the package, and I watched through the tinted windows as my carefully constructed safe life went up in literal smoke. The building I'd been living in for the past 6 months, now a crime scene that would have federal investigators crawling through every detail of every resident's background until they found the inconsistencies in Alessia Corvino's fabricated history. "You're assuming I have any interest in working with the man whose organization I've been actively avoiding for half a decade," I said. But the protest sounded weak even to my own ears because we both knew that the moment someone had connected the Phantom to Dante Ravenna in that explosive message, my options for independent survival had decreased dramatically. He turned to face me in the confined space of the SUV's back seat, his obsidian eyes reflecting the passing streetlights as Luca navigated us toward whatever secure location Dante maintained for exactly these kinds of emergencies, where his primary residence became uninhabitable. "I'm assuming you have interest in finding out who killed your family," he said bluntly, cutting through any pretense of detachment with the surgical precision of someone who understood exactly which vulnerabilities to target for maximum effect. "I'm assuming you've spent 3 years hiding and planning and gathering intelligence while you waited for the right moment to strike at the people responsible, and I'm offering you something that no amount of patient observation can provide: access to my organization's resources, my intelligence networks, my contacts in places that the Phantom could never reach without burning her cover so thoroughly that she'd be dead within hours of making the attempt." I wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain the independence that had kept me alive through countless impossible situations. But the truth was that the information I'd gathered in 3 years of cautious investigation had led me exactly nowhere except to dead ends and carefully sanitized records that suggested someone with significant power was actively obscuring the trail, leading back to my family's killers. "And what exactly do you get out of this arrangement?" I asked, watching his face for the tells that would indicate whether this was genuine cooperation or just an elaborate setup to eliminate me once I'd served whatever purpose he had in mind. "Because I find it extremely difficult to believe that you're offering me unlimited access to Chicago's most powerful criminal organization out of the goodness of your revenge-motivated heart. Which means there's something you want from me that you can't get through your existing resources." The smile that crossed his face was sharp enough to draw blood, equal parts dangerous, and darkly amused in a way that transformed his usually cold features into something almost charismatic, almost human, beneath all the calculated intimidation. "What I want," he said, leaning closer until I could feel the heat radiating from his injured body and smell the copper tang of blood still clinging to both of us, "is someone expendable yet skilled enough to infiltrate the Volkov Bratva, who are systematically eliminating Chicago's Mafia leadership through precisely the kind of coordinated attacks we experienced tonight. Someone who's already dead according to every database and intelligence network that matters. Someone who has absolutely nothing to lose and every reason to want the same people I want buried 6 feet under concrete." The Volkov Bratva, Russian organized crime that had been expanding their territory across the Midwest, with the kind of ruthless efficiency that suggested significant backing from sources beyond typical criminal enterprise, known for their willingness to employ tactics that even hardened mobsters found excessive. Rumored to have connections reaching all the way back to Moscow's intelligence apparatus, and the kind of state-sponsored resources that made conventional criminal organizations look like amateur operations. "You think the Volkovs were behind the attack tonight?" I said slowly, processing implications that went far deeper than simple territorial disputes or revenge killings. "You think they're the ones who sent that package to your lobby, which means they somehow discovered I'm alive and working with you in the span of less than 2 hours since Luciano's, which suggests they either have surveillance on you sophisticated enough to track our movements in real time, or they have someone inside your organization feeding them information." His jaw tightened at that assessment, the muscle jumping beneath his skin in a way that suggested I'd just articulated a fear he'd been trying not to examine too closely. "I've suspected a leak for the past 6 months, he admitted, the confession clearly costing him something, given how carefully he guarded any appearance of vulnerability or weakness. "Small things at first, shipments that got intercepted with suspicious timing, meetings that got ambushed by people who shouldn't have known about them, rivals who seemed to always be one step ahead of my strategic moves in ways that suggested someone was sharing my playbook with interested parties." Luca guided the SUV into an underground parking garage attached to what looked like an abandoned warehouse in one of Chicago's industrial districts, the kind of property that probably served as a safe house or secondary base of operations for exactly these situations where the primary locations became compromised. And I filed away mental notes about security vulnerabilities and escape routes even as I processed the larger implications of Dante's revelation about potential betrayal within his inner circle. "So you want me to go into the Volkov organization blind, with no backup and no guarantee that you won't just use me as bait to draw out whoever's leaking your information, all in exchange for vague promises of helping me find my family's killers?" I summarized, following him out of the vehicle and into the warehouse's dimly lit interior that smelled like old machinery and strategic paranoia. "I want you to consider," he said, leading me through corridors lined with enough weaponry to outfit a small military force, past rooms that clearly served as interrogation chambers and tactical planning centers, that the Volkovs suddenly becoming aggressive enough to attempt multiple assassinations in one night, right after someone tried to kill both of us with a dirty bomb that would have eliminated 2 of their biggest obstacles to controlling Chicago's underworld, suggests a level of coordination that goes beyond typical criminal enterprise and into the territory of the kind of sophisticated operation that would have the resources and motivation to orchestrate your family's massacre. We reached what appeared to be his secondary office, smaller than the penthouse but equally well appointed, with the kind of security measures that would make penetrating this location extraordinarily difficult. And he collapsed into a leather chair with a grimace that suggested his injury was catching up to him despite his stubborn refusal to show weakness. "I'll give you everything I have on the Volkov organization," he continued, pulling up files on a computer system that probably had enough encryption to frustrate even NSA-level attempts at access. Their leadership structure, their known operations, their suspected connections to Russian intelligence, and most importantly, the information I've gathered suggesting they were actively recruiting Marco in the months before his death, offering him things that should have been impossible for a criminal organization to deliver unless they had backing from people with access to state-level resources. That got my attention in ways that his previous arguments hadn't. Because if the Volkovs had been working with Marco Ravenna, if they'd been using him to undermine his brother's organization from the inside, then the connection to my family's massacre suddenly became less theoretical and more horrifyingly plausible. "You think your brother was working for the Volkovs when he discovered whatever got him killed?" I said, moving to examine the files he was pulling up with growing recognition of patterns that matched intelligence I'd gathered through my own investigation. "You think he found out something about their operations or their backers that made him a liability, and they used the Phantom's reputation as cover to eliminate him in a way that would misdirect your revenge away from them and toward a convenient scapegoat?" He nodded slowly, his expression grim, as he pulled up a photograph that made my blood run cold. Marco Ravenna meeting with a man I recognized from my own family's last dinner party, a supposed business associate of my father's who disappeared the day after the massacre and had never been found despite extensive efforts to track him down. "Dmitry Volkov," Dante identified the man in the photograph, though I'd known him as Alessandro Marchetti when he'd sat at our table drinking my father's wine and complimenting my mother's cooking, while presumably planning their deaths. Head of the Bratva's Chicago operations, suspected of personally orchestrating at least 40 assassinations in the past 5 years, and according to intelligence I've gathered from sources that cost me considerable resources and several good men, he was in Naples 4 years ago, meeting with someone connected to the Corsetti family in the weeks before your compound was attacked. The rage that flooded through me at seeing that face again, at having confirmation that the man who'd smiled at me across dinner while planning my family's annihilation was not only alive but thriving as a major criminal power, was so intense that I had to grip the edge of Dante's desk to keep my hands from shaking with the need to find Dmitry Volkov immediately and introduce him to every torture technique I'd learned during my years as the Phantom. "So we have a common enemy," I managed through teeth clenched so hard my jaw ached. "We have a man who orchestrated my family's deaths, who corrupted your brother and then had him killed to cover the evidence, who's now actively trying to eliminate both of us because apparently we've gotten too close to whatever truth he's desperate to keep buried, and you're offering me the resources to infiltrate his organization and destroy him from the inside." "I'm offering you revenge," Dante corrected, standing despite his injury to move around the desk until he was close enough that I could see the deadly promise burning in his obsidian eyes. "I'm offering you the chance to make Dmitry Volkov and everyone who helped him pay for every life they destroyed, every family they shattered, every person they killed in their climb to power, and all I ask in return is that you let me stand beside you when the reckoning comes, that you allow me to honor my brother's memory by finishing what he died trying to expose." I should have questioned his motives more thoroughly, should have demanded better guarantees and clearer terms before agreeing to alliance with a man who had every reason to want me dead regardless of our shared enemy. But the opportunity to finally confront the people who'd murdered everyone I loved was too compelling to resist, even if it meant walking into obvious danger with a partner I couldn't fully trust. "I want full access to your intelligence on the Volkovs," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning through me like acid. "I want weapons, resources, backup if the infiltration goes wrong, and most importantly, I want your word that if I die during this operation, you'll finish what we started and make absolutely certain that Dmitry Volkov understands exactly what he destroyed before you put a bullet in his brain." He extended his hand, the gesture formal and binding in a way that suggested this was more than just a business arrangement, but something closer to a blood oath between warriors who recognized kindred darkness in each other. "You have my word," he said as I clasped his hand, his grip firm despite the injury and blood loss. "And in return, you'll have mine. If I fall before we finish this, you'll make sure the Volkov Bratva understands that eliminating Dante Ravenna only unleashed something far worse than anything my organization could have done to them." We were sealing a pact that would almost certainly end in violence and blood, and the kind of mutually assured destruction that left cities burning and empires crumbling. But in that moment, standing in his secondary office, surrounded by weapons and encrypted files, and the accumulated evidence of years spent planning revenge, I felt more purpose than I'd experienced since the night I'd learned my entire family was gone, and I was utterly alone in a world that suddenly made no sense. "There's one more thing you should know," Dante said after we'd released our handshake, his expression shifting to something darker and more concerned as he pulled up another file on his computer. "The dirty bomb that was delivered to my building tonight. Chicago PD just sent through preliminary analysis, and the radiation signature matches nuclear material that was supposedly secured by Russian intelligence after the Soviet collapse. Material that shouldn't exist outside of state-controlled facilities. Which means the Volkovs aren't just a criminal organization, but something far more dangerous with connections reaching into levels of power that can access weapons-grade materials and deploy them in American cities without apparent fear of consequences." Before I could fully process the implications of what he was telling me, before I could begin to calculate how much deeper this conspiracy went than either of us had suspected, his phone erupted with an incoming call that he answered with visible reluctance, his expression darkening progressively as he listened to whatever information was being delivered. "When?" he demanded, his voice dropping to something lethal and cold. "How many casualties? Are you certain about the identification?" He ended the call and looked at me with an expression that combined fury and something that might have been genuine sympathy if I didn't know better than to trust emotional displays from a man who'd built his empire on calculated manipulation. "They took Sophia," he said quietly, each word carefully controlled as though he was using every ounce of discipline to prevent himself from exploding into violence. "My sister was supposed to be at her apartment with full security detail, but the Volkovs hit them 20 minutes ago with enough force to overwhelm trained professionals, and they left a message saying that if I want her returned alive, I'll deliver the Phantom to them within 48 hours, or they'll send me pieces of her until there's nothing left to bury." The silence that followed that declaration was suffocating, both of us understanding simultaneously that this had just transformed from a strategic alliance into something far more personal and far more urgent. And I found myself making calculations about risk and reward and acceptable losses that I'd hoped never to make again. "Sophia's 16 years old," I said, remembering the bright-eyed girl I'd seen occasionally in Dante's company, the sister he protected with the kind of fierce devotion that suggested she was the only purely good thing left in his corrupted world. "She has nothing to do with any of this. She's an innocent civilian who shouldn't be anywhere near the kind of violence we're planning, and using her as leverage is exactly the sort of thing that makes me want to find Dmitry Volkov immediately and show him what the Phantom does to people who hurt children." Dante was already moving, gathering weapons and tactical gear with movements made slightly clumsy by his injury, but still efficient enough to be concerning. And I realized with growing alarm that he was planning to mount an immediate rescue operation despite being in no physical condition for the kind of combat that would certainly be required. "You can't go in there bleeding and compromised," I told him, moving to block his path toward the armory. "You can't mount a one-man assault on a Volkov stronghold when you've lost enough blood that you should probably be in a hospital, and throwing your life away in a suicidal rescue attempt doesn't help Sophia, doesn't help our investigation, and doesn't do anything except give Dmitry exactly what he wants, which is both of us dead and his secrets safely buried with our bodies." His hand shot out to grip my throat, not hard enough to truly threaten, but firm enough to make his point about how desperately close to the edge he was, his eyes blazing with the kind of barely controlled fury that made him Chicago's most dangerous criminal rather than just another powerful mobster. "That's my sister," he growled, his face inches from mine. "That's the only family I have left. The only person in this entire corrupted city who looks at me and sees something other than a monster. And if you think I'm going to sit here making tactical assessments while the Volkovs do to her what they did to your family, then you fundamentally misunderstand what I'm willing to sacrifice to keep her safe." I met his gaze without flinching, my hands coming up to rest on his wrist in a grip that was gentle despite the violence simmering between us. "I understand exactly what you're willing to sacrifice," I said quietly. "I understand because I made the same calculations 4 years ago when I was halfway across the world and got the call that my family was under attack. And I tried to get to them in time, despite knowing it was impossible. Despite understanding that throwing myself into obvious danger wouldn't save them, but would only add my corpse to the body count. And I've lived with that guilt every single day since then, wondering if there was something different I could have done. Some way I could have been faster or smarter, or more prepared." His grip on my throat loosened fractionally, recognition flickering across his features as he processed what I was telling him. And I could see the exact moment when the immediate rage started to transform into something more strategic and potentially more dangerous. "So what do you suggest?" he asked, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Because if your plan involves waiting 48 hours to see if they actually release her unharmed in exchange for you, then I'm going to need you to explain why I shouldn't just take my chances with the frontal assault and pray that I can kill enough of them fast enough to extract Sophia before they realize what's happening." I released his wrist and stepped back, my mind already racing through tactical scenarios and probability assessments that had kept me alive through situations where any rational person would have died. "I suggest," I said slowly, the plan forming even as I spoke, "that we give Dmitry Volkov exactly what he thinks he wants. We deliver the Phantom to him in a way that looks like you've betrayed me to save your sister. We make it convincing enough that he believes he's won and lets his guard down. And then we show him exactly why the Phantom earned her reputation by being the nightmare that other nightmares have when they close their eyes and try to sleep." The smile that crossed Dante's face at that suggestion was absolutely feral, dark, and dangerous, and filled with the kind of anticipatory violence that reminded me exactly why he'd survived decades in a business where most leaders died young and unmourned. And I realized with a strange sort of clarity that we were about to walk into the kind of trap that had killed better operatives than both of us combined, but we were going to do it anyway, because sometimes revenge required being willing to gamble everything on a single desperate play. "Then let's make sure," he said, pulling me against him with his good arm in a gesture that felt proprietary and possessive, and absolutely inappropriate given our complicated history. "That when Dmitry Volkov realizes he's been played, when he understands that delivering Sophia was the biggest mistake he could have possibly made, that the last thing he sees before the Phantom sends him to whatever hell waits for men like him is your face. So he dies knowing exactly who destroyed everything he built, and why his arrogance in underestimating a ghost was the fatal flaw that ended his empire." And as we stood there in his secondary office surrounded by weapons and plans for mutually assured destruction, I felt something shift between us. Some fundamental recognition that we were no longer separate entities pursuing parallel revenge, but something more unified and infinitely more dangerous. And when his phone buzzed with an incoming message that contained a photograph of Sophia, bound and terrified, with Dmitry Volkov's smiling face beside her, I knew with absolute certainty that we were about to unleash the kind of violence that would make Chicago's bloodiest gang wars look like civilized disagreements. And I found myself eagerly anticipating every moment of the destruction we were about to rain down on everyone who'd ever thought that ghosts stayed buried when you wanted them to. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be hunted, to have my past clawing its way into my present with blood-stained fingers and broken promises. But standing in the center of the Volkov Bratva's warehouse, with my hands zip-tied behind my back, and Dmitry Volkov circling me like a shark who'd finally caught the prey that had eluded him for years, I remembered with crystalline clarity exactly why I'd walked away from this life, and why returning to it felt simultaneously like coming home and descending into the specific circle of hell reserved for people who'd made violence into an art form. The betrayal had been executed perfectly. Dante delivering me to the Volkovs with exactly the right amount of reluctant desperation. His performance as a brother choosing family over alliance convincing enough that even I might have believed it if we hadn't spent the previous 12 hours planning every detail of this infiltration, mapping every possible exit route and contingency plan, while his shoulder wound continued to seep blood through fresh bandages that suggested he was pushing his body far beyond what medical wisdom would recommend. Sophia was there, visible through the warehouse's interior windows in a separate room where they'd been keeping her, and I could see the terror in her wide eyes that reminded me painfully of my younger sister Maria in those last moments before everything had turned to fire and screaming, and the kind of loss that carved holes in your soul that never quite healed. "The Phantom," Dmitri said in accented English that carried undertones of Moscow's elite training programs, moving close enough that I could smell the expensive cologne that had been his signature scent even when he'd sat at my family's table, pretending to be a legitimate businessman named Alessandro Marchetti. 3 years I believed you were dead. 3 years I congratulated myself on eliminating the only witness who could have connected me to the Corsetti massacre. And here you are, delivered to me by the very man whose brother you supposedly killed. Which suggests that the universe has a sense of irony that I can appreciate even as I plan exactly how I'm going to make you suffer, before I finally grant you the death you've been running from. I met his gaze without flinching, letting him see the Phantom looking back at him through eyes that had witnessed atrocities he couldn't begin to imagine, that had participated in darkness deep enough to drown entire civilizations. And I watched with cold satisfaction as recognition flickered across his features, followed by something that might have been actual fear, before he mastered the expression and returned to his carefully constructed facade of complete control. "You made a mistake," I told him quietly, my voice steady despite the zip ties cutting into my wrists and the very real possibility that this plan could deteriorate into catastrophic failure at any moment. "You made the same mistake that everyone who's ever underestimated me has made, which is assuming that being captured means being helpless, that having my hands bound means I've lost the capacity to destroy you and everything you've built. And I'm going to enjoy watching you realize exactly how thoroughly you've miscalculated in the moments before I show you what happens to men who kill children and think they can escape the consequences." He backhanded me hard enough to split my lip, the copper taste of blood flooding my mouth as I went down to one knee. But I was already moving through the pain, already shifting my weight and testing the structural integrity of the zip ties while maintaining the appearance of being stunned and disoriented by the blow. "Such confidence from a woman who's about to die screaming," he said, gesturing to 2 of his men who moved forward with the kind of casual violence that suggested they'd done this many times before, dragging me upright and toward what was clearly going to be an interrogation session designed to extract every piece of information I possessed about Dante's organization, before they killed me in ways that would serve as warnings to anyone else who considered interfering with Volkov operations. But what Dmitri didn't know, what none of them knew because Dante and I had been extraordinarily careful to ensure our preparation went undetected, was that the tracking device embedded in my arm was already transmitting our location to every member of Dante's organization, who was currently converging on this warehouse, with enough firepower to level the entire block. And the seemingly standard zip ties binding my wrists contained a monofilament blade that I could deploy with the right amount of pressure and finger manipulation that I'd been practicing throughout this entire theatrical performance. Sophia was the variable we couldn't fully control, the element of unpredictability that could transform this rescue operation into a bloodbath if the Volkovs decided to use her as a human shield or execute her the moment they realized they were under attack. But I'd made eye contact with her during my initial survey of the space and seen the intelligence burning behind her fear, seen the way she was already scanning for opportunities and cataloging her captor's patterns in ways that suggested Dante had trained his sister better than anyone had suspected. The interrogation room they dragged me into smelled like old blood and industrial chemicals, the scent triggering memories of a dozen similar spaces where I'd either been the interrogator or the subject depending on which organization had me and what information they were trying to extract. And I let them chain me to the bolted-down chair while I continued my internal countdown of how long until Dante's assault team would be in position and ready to breach. "I'm going to ask you questions," Dimitri said, pulling up a chair to sit across from me with the casual confidence of someone who believed he held all the power in this dynamic. "And you're going to answer them truthfully and completely, and if you cooperate, I might make your death relatively quick instead of the extended symphony of suffering I've been planning since I realized you'd survived the warehouse fire that was supposed to have ended the Phantom permanently." I laughed at that. The sound rough and genuine because the absurdity of him thinking I would cooperate with anything he asked was almost too much to process. And I watched his expression darken with fury at my perceived insolence. "You want to know what I know about Dante's organization?" I said, leaning forward as much as the chains would allow. "You want me to give you detailed intelligence about his operations, his security protocols, his backup locations, his supply chains, everything you'd need to finish what you started tonight when you tried to kill him with that dirty bomb and failed spectacularly, because apparently your intelligence about his defensive capabilities was significantly less comprehensive than you believed?" He moved faster than I'd anticipated, his fist connecting with my ribs in a blow that would definitely leave bruising and possibly crack bone. But the pain was almost welcome because it meant he was getting emotional, getting sloppy, abandoning the careful control that had made him such an effective operator, in favor of the kind of rage-driven violence that created exploitable vulnerabilities. "Tell me what I want to know," he demanded, his face inches from mine. "Or I'll bring Sophia in here and let my men entertain themselves with her while you watch, and then I'll make you listen to her screaming while I explain in excruciating detail exactly how your father begged for his life before I put a bullet in his brain, how your mother tried to negotiate for her children's safety right up until the moment I slit her throat, how your siblings died confused and terrified because they couldn't understand why the nice man who'd had dinner with them was suddenly killing everyone they loved." The rage that flooded through me at hearing him speak about my family's final moments, at having confirmation that he'd personally orchestrated and participated in their murders, was so intense that the zip ties snapped as I unconsciously flexed against them with strength born of pure fury, the monofilament blade I'd been gradually working free suddenly unnecessary as my wrists came apart, and I was moving before conscious thought could interfere, my hands finding his throat even as his eyes widened with the realization that he'd made a catastrophic tactical error. "You're going to tell me everything," I said, my thumbs pressing against his carotid arteries, with exactly the right amount of pressure to make him lightheaded without rendering him unconscious. "You're going to explain who ordered the Corsetti massacre and why. You're going to detail every connection between your organization and the state-level resources that gave you access to nuclear material, and you're going to do it right now before Dante Ravenna arrives with enough men and weapons to turn this warehouse into a crater, because that's your only chance of surviving the next 5 minutes with your brain still functioning inside your skull." The explosion that rocked the warehouse's exterior wall answered the question of whether Dante's assault team was in position, the carefully coordinated breach happening exactly on schedule as automatic weapons fire erupted throughout the facility and the Volkov soldiers who'd been guarding me rushed toward the new threat, leaving me alone with Dimitri in an interrogation room that had suddenly become his prison rather than mine. "Marco Ravenna didn't discover evidence of your operations," I continued, maintaining my grip on his throat, while I processed the sounds of combat filtering through the walls. "Marco was actively working with you, wasn't he? Helping you undermine his brother's organization from the inside. And whatever he found that got him killed wasn't about the Volkovs at all, but about whoever's been backing you, whoever gave you the resources and political protection to operate with impunity across multiple countries and orchestrate massacres that should have brought down international task forces and intelligence investigations." His expression confirmed what I'd suspected, even before he managed to choke out words through my constricting grip. And I eased the pressure fractionally to let him speak, because the information he possessed was worth more than the immediate satisfaction of crushing his windpipe. "State Department," he gasped, the admission seemingly torn from him by the combination of oxygen deprivation and the dawning realization that his carefully constructed empire was collapsing around him. "Rogue faction using our organization as deniable assets for operations that couldn't be officially sanctioned. Your father discovered financial irregularities that would have exposed the entire network. Marco found the same evidence 5 years ago and threatened to go public unless they eliminated Dante and installed him as the primary Ravenna contact. So they had me kill him and frame the Phantom to misdirect the investigation while they restructured their operational security." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, reaching far beyond typical criminal enterprise into the territory of governmental corruption at levels that could topple administrations if exposed properly. And I found myself reassessing everything I'd believed about my family's deaths and Marco's betrayal in light of this new information. The door to the interrogation room burst open then, Dante appearing with his weapon raised and his shoulder wound obviously reopened based on the fresh blood staining his tactical vest, his eyes scanning the scene and landing on me with an expression that combined relief and something darker that made my pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with the adrenaline still flooding my system from combat. "Sophia," I said immediately, maintaining my grip on Dimitri because we weren't finished extracting information, and I wasn't about to let him slip away before we'd documented every detail of the corruption he'd just outlined. "Where is she? Is she safe? Did your men secure her before the Volkovs could use her as leverage or execute her out of spite?" "She's safe," Dante confirmed, moving into the room with his weapon still trained on Dimitri, with the kind of deadly focus that suggested he was exercising enormous self-control, not to simply execute the man who'd orchestrated his brother's death and countless other atrocities. "She's with Luca and Marco in the extraction vehicle, unharmed except for some bruising and psychological trauma that we'll deal with once we've finished here. And she specifically asked me to make sure you survived, because apparently you made quite an impression during your brief eye contact, and she's convinced you're some kind of avenging angel sent to protect her from the monsters." Before any of us could process the implications of that statement, before we could begin the detailed interrogation that would extract every piece of actionable intelligence from Dmitry Volkov's suddenly very cooperative brain, the secondary explosion that rocked the warehouse's foundation suggested that someone had decided scorched earth was preferable to allowing us to leave with the information we'd gathered, and I found myself making split-second calculations about survival versus revenge as the building began its structural collapse around us, with the kind of inevitable finality that suggested we had maybe 30 seconds to extract ourselves before the entire facility became our tomb. And Dante's hand was already reaching for mine, as we both recognized simultaneously that we were about to discover whether our partnership could survive actual apocalyptic danger, or whether this was where our alliance ended in fire and falling concrete, and the kind of dramatic irony that would make our enemies laugh at how close we'd come to exposing everything before dying in the rubble of our own ambitions. I woke up in silk sheets that smelled like him, my body stitched together by the same hands that had once ordered my death based on fabricated evidence and carefully orchestrated lies, and the irony of being alive at all when the warehouse collapse should have buried us under tons of concrete and twisted metal wasn't lost on me as I assessed the damage to my ribs and the fresh surgical incisions that suggested Dante had called in his private surgeon to handle injuries that went far beyond what field medicine could address. The bedroom was flooded with afternoon light that painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and I could see Dante sitting in the chair beside the bed, where he'd apparently stationed himself for however long I'd been unconscious, his shoulder freshly bandaged and his face drawn with exhaustion that spoke of days without sleep, while he'd ensured my survival with the same ruthless determination he applied to everything else in his carefully controlled existence. "You stayed," I said, my voice rough from smoke inhalation and the breathing tube they'd probably had to use during surgery, and I watched something shift in his obsidian eyes at the sound of my voice. Relief and something deeper that he was clearly trying not to examine too closely. "I stayed," he confirmed, leaning forward to press a glass of water to my lips, with surprising gentleness given that these were hands that had killed dozens of men and orchestrated violence on scales that most people couldn't comprehend. I stayed because you pulled me out of that collapsing warehouse when you could have saved yourself, because you grabbed Dmitry Volkov's unconscious body and dragged both of us through an exit that barely existed while the entire structure came down around our heads, and because somewhere during this absolutely catastrophic partnership, I realized that I'd been hunting the wrong ghost for 5 years, and the real enemy had been laughing at both of us while we tore each other apart over manufactured grievances. The water soothed my raw throat enough that I could speak more clearly, and I struggled to sit up despite the protests from my battered body, needing to see his face properly while we had this conversation that would determine whether we'd actually survived this ordeal or just postponed our mutual destruction. Dmitry talked before the explosion, I said, watching his expression carefully for any sign that he was going to dispute what I'd learned in those final moments before someone had tried to bury all the evidence under rubble and fire. He confirmed that Marco was working with the Volkovs, but under coercion from State Department officials who were using the Bratva as deniable assets for black operations. He admitted that my father discovered the financial networks funding these illegal activities, and that Marco found the same evidence when he was doing due diligence on a supposedly legitimate shipping contract. And he explained that both of them were killed not because they were threats to criminal organizations, but because they'd stumbled onto governmental corruption that reached high enough to destabilize entire political structures if it became public. Dante's jaw tightened at the confirmation of what we'd both suspected, but hadn't wanted to fully acknowledge. The implications too vast and too dangerous to confront without absolute certainty. I've been investigating Marco's death for 5 years, he said quietly, his hands clenching into fists that suggested he was struggling with rage that had nowhere productive to direct itself, now that the simple narrative of revenge had been complicated by layers of conspiracy and institutional betrayal. I've spent half a decade hunting the Phantom, convinced that killing you would somehow balance the scales and honor my brother's memory. And it turns out that everything I believed about his death was a carefully constructed fiction designed to keep me focused on the wrong target, while the real architects of his murder continued operating with impunity. I reached out to cover his clenched fist with my hand, the gesture feeling simultaneously natural and terrifying given our complicated history and the violence that had defined our relationship until very recently. Your brother wasn't the man you thought he was, I said gently, knowing that this truth would hurt worse than any physical wound, but unable to let him continue believing in a sanitized version of Marco that bore no resemblance to reality. But he also wasn't the simple traitor that the Volkovs wanted us to believe either. He was a man caught between impossible choices, between family loyalty and threats against people he loved, between doing what was right and surviving long enough to expose the corruption that had ensnared him, and in the end, he chose to try to bring everything into the light even though he knew it would probably get him killed. The evidence we'd recovered from the warehouse before the explosion, the files that Dante's men had extracted from Volkov computers during those chaotic minutes of our escape, painted a picture of conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American government and connected to intelligence operations spanning multiple administrations and countless illegal activities that had been hidden behind layers of deniable cutouts and criminal proxies. Sophia had been the catalyst we'd needed, her kidnapping forcing us into action before we were fully prepared, but also creating the urgency that had allowed us to penetrate Volkov's security in ways that careful planning might never have achieved. And I found myself grateful for her resilience and intelligence that had kept her alive long enough for our rescue operation to succeed, despite all the variables that could have turned catastrophic. She wants to meet you properly? Dante said, apparently following my thoughts toward his sister, with the kind of intuition that suggested we'd developed a connection during our shared near-death experience that went beyond strategic alliance or temporary cooperation. Sophia has decided that you're some kind of hero from her favorite books, and she's been sitting outside this door for the past 2 days, waiting for you to wake up. so she can thank you for saving her life and also interrogate you about whether you're going to stay or disappear again into whatever shadows you emerged from. The question inherent in that statement hung between us like something tangible and weighted with implications that terrified me more than facing down armed mercenaries or infiltrating hostile organizations, because staying meant abandoning the careful isolation I'd maintained since my family's death, meant allowing people to matter again in ways that created vulnerabilities I'd spent 3 years trying to eliminate. I should leave, I said, but the words lacked conviction even to my own ears. I should disappear before the State Department realizes we survived and starts hunting us both, before whatever rogue faction was using the Volkovs decides that eliminating loose ends is preferable to risking exposure, before Sophia gets attached to someone who brings nothing but danger and violence into every life she touches. Dante's hand turned beneath mine to capture my wrist, his thumb finding my pulse point with the kind of deliberate intimacy that made my breath catch, despite all my training in emotional control. You should stay, he countered, his voice dropping to something rough and honest that stripped away all his usual calculated manipulation. You should stay because running hasn't kept you safe, because isolation hasn't healed the wounds your family's death carved into your soul, because Sophia needs someone who understands what it's like to survive trauma and come out the other side still fighting, and because somewhere during this absolute disaster of an alliance, I've realized that the ghost I've been hunting for 5 years is the only person in this entire corrupted world who actually understands what it costs to be what we are. The kiss that followed wasn't gentle or tentative, but fierce and desperate, tasting like blood and smoke and shared survival, his good hand tangling in my hair while I pulled him closer despite my injured ribs screaming protest. And in that moment of surrendering to the connection we'd been fighting since the first night at Luciano's, I felt something fundamental shift in how I understood my own capacity for healing and moving forward. I should hate you, I whispered against his mouth when we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard and staring at each other, with the kind of raw honesty that neither of us typically allowed anyone to witness. You do hate me, he responded, his lips curving into a smile that was equal parts dangerous and genuinely warm. That's what makes this so dangerous, what makes us so dangerous together, because we're both ghosts trying to haunt a world that wants us buried, and the only people who can understand what that means are others who've already died and come back as something sharper and more ruthless than what we were before. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of recovery and revolution, as we systematically exposed the State Department corruption, using the evidence we'd gathered, watching political careers implode and intelligence operations unravel, while we maintained enough operational security to avoid becoming convenient scapegoats for people desperate to contain the damage. Sophia became the unexpected center of our strange found family, her resilience and refusal to be traumatized by her kidnapping, somehow healing wounds in both Dante and myself that we hadn't realized still needed tending, and I found myself learning how to be something other than the Phantom for the first time since my family's massacre. Dmitry Volkov survived the warehouse collapse only to face federal prosecution for crimes that would keep him imprisoned for multiple lifetimes. His cooperation in exposing his government handlers, the only thing that saved him from more immediate and violent justice. And while part of me wanted to finish what we'd started in that interrogation room, I found a strange satisfaction in knowing that he would spend the rest of his life trapped in the kind of cage that someone like him would find infinitely worse than death. The rogue State Department officials were harder to touch, protected by layers of institutional immunity and political connections that made direct action impossible. But we'd exposed enough of their operations that their effectiveness was permanently compromised, and sometimes revenge meant settling for making sure your enemies never stopped looking over their shoulders. We're both ghosts, Ravenna, I told Dante one night as we stood on his penthouse balcony overlooking the city that had become our shared territory. Sophia asleep in the guest room that had gradually transformed into her permanent residence, as we'd rebuilt something resembling a family from the broken pieces of our separate tragedies. Might as well haunt this city together, and make sure that everyone who ever thought they could destroy us and walk away, learns exactly what it means to awaken ghosts who remember everything and forgive nothing. His arm came around my waist, pulling me against his side with the kind of possessive certainty that would have terrified me months ago, but now felt like the only anchor keeping me connected to something real and solid in a world built on convenient fictions and strategic betrayals. "Then let's make sure they never forget our names, Phantasma Mia," he murmured against my hair, his voice carrying promises of violence and protection and the kind of partnership that transcended simple categories of love or alliance. "Let's make sure that when they tell stories about Chicago's underworld and the ghosts who ruled it, they speak of us with the kind of reverent terror reserved for legends who never quite died, but just learned to haunt more strategically." And standing there in the darkness with his heartbeat steady against my back and Sophia's peaceful breathing audible through the open door, I realized that sometimes the only way to survive being destroyed was to let yourself be rebuilt by the most unlikely people, to find family not in blood relations or shared history, but in mutual recognition of what it means to be broken and dangerous and still somehow reaching for something better than the darkness that created you. And as the city lights spread out beneath us like captured stars, I felt something very much like peace settle into the spaces where grief and rage had lived for so long, knowing that whatever came next, whatever enemies emerged from the shadows to test our hard-won stability, we would face them together as partners and equals and ghosts who had finally found a home worth haunting